In this screen recording, what I want to have a look at is animating some effects and using layer styles. You can see this little FX button down in the bottom right corner. This is going to activate our layer styles that we can apply to certain things. And what I actually want to do here is I've got a video where I've got two little smoke effects, and I've kind of just mirrored them and moved them around a bit. And I want to add some particles here and maybe some color and stuff like that and get them going. Now we are using Photoshop for this, and obviously in stuff like After Effects you can create all sorts of particles as well, but just to show you some really cool tricks that we can actually do in Photoshop. So first of all, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create some actual particles, and the way that we're going to apply these is as a actual adjustment or an effect, sorry. So I'm just going to create an empty layer here, and here it is in my timeline. And again, depending if you're doing this in an animatic or something like that, you'll need to adjust that to the duration. This is 5 seconds, which is the default anyway. And I'm just going to grab my paint bucket here, shortcut G, make sure it's actually it could be the gradient tool either, and I'm just going to fill it in with a color. And it really doesn't matter what the color is at the moment. We just need a solid area for our pattern to be applied, because we're going to use a pattern to add some particles. Now if we go to our little FX buttons, which is going to be our layer styles, and we go to pattern overlay, and what you'll see is there are a bunch of default patterns that you can play around with. There's others that you can load up as well, and you can go through all these, and there's some funky rock things. Now a quick look at these. What you can notice is you can start scaling these up and down, and we can actually also move patterns around, so they're really useful. I love using patterns. They're really quite effective. So you can scale and move them around, which you wouldn't typically be able to do if you just used a pattern fill, which you can actually use with the paintbrush. So you can go paintbrush, you can go foreground pattern, and you can select whatever pattern you want. Let's go for one that's the same pattern, and it's going to fill in there, but we don't actually have control over its position and its scale. The other cool thing with this is that we are going to be able to animate these patterns as well. So here's one I created earlier, but we can actually animate the movement and the scaling of these patterns, which is what we're going to use to try and create some particles. So I'm going to cancel out of this one, and I want to create my patterns afresh. So to do this, I'm going to open up a new document. So I'm going to go File, New, and let's bring this onto the screen here. And what I want to look at is setting up a square document. So a square document is just going to make our life a little bit easier when we're dealing with patterns. And I'm going to create something that's roughly about 500 pixels by 500 pixels. You don't want to be too big, but you don't want to be too small either, depending on how much you want to happen in your pattern. So 500 by 500, and I'm just going to hit create, and there's our little square shape that we're going to start building our pattern in. Now with patterns, what you want to do is if there's going to be any transparency on them, you need to make sure you create them on a transparent layer. Brushes are slightly different. You're creating brushes. White and black will play a part in creating the brushes, where black will be transparent, white will be visible. But in patterns, we do need to try and make whatever we're going to paint on here in a transparent layer. And I'm going to keep this relatively simple. There are a few little things we need to keep an eye on, which I'll mention as we go along. So I'm just going to go B for brush, bring up my brush tool, and there's and I'm actually going to go, and if you are using the Adobe CC, we can build this stuff manually, but I'm going to actually do a real quick one and go to some of Kyle's splatter brushes here. I'm going to turn on this background white layer, and I'm going to select black as a color for my brush, and I'm just going to have a quick look at that and see how these brushes affect. And I just want to, the way these are sort of built is they're going to be sort of like a random splatter. Now I actually don't want too many splatters for this, so you might want to try a few different brushes for this. I think this one works relatively well. Adjust the sizing and stuff like that. Now I do want to point out there are some issues with creating patterns. It's probably not going to matter too much on this one, but you need to be wary of the fact that patterns are going to repeat themselves. So in this case we've got a bunch of spots, and hopefully it's not going to look too uniform. You need to watch out for things like this little one here, which is going to be repeat itself, so it's going to be cut off each time we create it. So you may wish to go back and just sort of hit the edges a little bit, and I'm just using the eraser here, and just clean up anything that you don't want in your brush. So anything that's going to be quite obvious, as far as like double blobs and stuff like that, is also going to be quite obvious when you are repeating your pattern. So I'm going to try that out, see how it works. I'm going to hide that background. So I've just got these little black blobs here, and I'm going to create this as a pattern. So I'm going to go to edit, and there it is, edit, and all the way down just past the middle, define pattern. And this is going to give us this option here, and I'm going to call this splatter 2, or actually let's call it embers, because that's kind of what I want to, embers 1, give it a name and save that. Now this is now saved to your pattern library specific to where you've created it, and you can save these out and that kind of thing. Alright, let's jump into my document here. So here's my smoke popping through here. Here's my just big filled in layer. It's just a big green filled in layer, and I'm going to add a pattern to this. I'm going to go FX, I'm going to go to pattern overlay, and your pattern is actually, if you jump into your patterns here, usually it's going to be, I'm just going to go to this little cog mechanism. I'm going to just sort of, usually you'll see your thumbnails here, and you'll see some default ones, and you've got trees and you've got grass and you've got stuff like that, depending on which version you're working with. And then right at the bottom, this is going to be the patterns that you've created, and the last one you created is going to be here. And you can go by text, and you can see if we go down, embers _1 right there as well. So a couple of things to look at. That doesn't really look all that impressive right now, but you've got a scale option, so I can start scaling this up, and then we can start seeing the pattern, and you can start seeing where there's some obvious bits where it looks like it's repeating itself. So the smaller you get, the more it's going to seem like it's repeating itself. So I'm just going to sort of scale it up until I get something that I want to work with for that pattern, just to get the scaling close. And then I'm going to hit OK. So that is now applied to that green rectangle that I've created, and I can move that around, and that pattern is going to stick with whatever I do with that, unless I start doing some weird transformations. So there it is, effects, pattern overlay. I can turn it on and off. I can double click on that and re-edit it, and I've got access to all my other layer styles as well. But the problem is I actually want to see behind this, so I want to see the clouds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the fill option up the top here. Now opacity, which is above, which a lot of people will go, is going to affect both the layer, so the green rectangle, and the effect, so, or the layer style. So it's going to make both of them transparent. So I quite often get people saying, what's the point of having fill? Fill's there if you've got a regular layer. If I lower the fill, it's going to look like it's lowering the opacity, which it is, but fill is going to lower the opacity only of the actual layer. So only this green rectangle is going to lower the fill opacity. I'm just going to drop that to 0. So now what I'm going to see is my pattern only, which is kind of cool. So that's great, and what I can do now is I can actually animate the pattern overlay in this. So I can go to my layer 1, and I'm going to rename this, let's call it embers, just so we know, and I'm going to right click on that and just give it little red identifier, so I can easily find it in my timeline and my layer panel. And I'm going to use the drop down here. Let's bring this up a bit, and you'll see it says position, opacity, and style. Now typically if you're going to animate this rectangle at all, I would suggest converting it to a smart object so that it can be rotated or scaled. Now I am actually going to convert it to a smart object anyway, but I'm going to do some other stuff first. So first thing I'm going to do is actually animate these embers moving. So I'm going to click on style, and that is going to put it in a keyframe there. And I'm just going to scrub to the end of my timeline, and I'm going to grab my move tool. Let's double click on the pattern overlay, opening that up. So now I've got pattern overlay selected. Now what I'm going to do is just move those embers down a little bit and hit OK. And that will create a keyframe. And as I scrub that past, you can see that those embers are now going to be moving. And I can drop in other keyframes for this. You just need to make sure that you've got the pattern overlay turned on and that you're not just moving the green rectangle, so I can actually move that, and then once you jump out of that, it will apply it. And you can see now I've got that little weird moving left and then switching to the right, but I'm going to get rid of that. I just want it nice and simple, and I might just move this across. Again, I've messed it up. I just got to remember, click on the pattern overlay first. It's very tempting to just move the object, and that's just going to get that little moving from top right to bottom left. There's a little bit of movement happening there. So as you're going to do, really simple, and because it's a repeating pattern, it's going to look like it's flowing on and on forever. So that's really cool. But what I actually want to do is I want to turn these into glowing embers, and they're currently just black little blobs at the moment, and I want to add another layer style to them. So I'm going to show you why this isn't going to work. But if I go effects and let's go to color overlay, which is going to add a color, and I've already picked out a nice bright orange for this as far as the color. If I set that to normal, it's gonna add a color overlay to that entire layer, and that entire layer is just a big rectangle. So you know, that's just, even though, because the fill on the rectangle is 0, my effect is saying whatever that shape is, and it literally could be any shape. If I cut a hole in that, it's going to apply that whole thing to that shape. It's going to apply that color to that. So it's really not going to work in adding a color to my embers. So I'm going to turn that off. So how do we color this basically? So the quick way of doing this is quite simply, just noticed a keyframe there, I'm going to delete, is we're going to convert this now to a smart object. And remember, smart objects can contain multiple layers, and they'll keep referencing through. So if I want to change my pattern or anything, I can do it by re-entering into my smart object, but I'm going to right click on that and go convert to smart object. Okay, so there it is there. It still says embers. It's lost its color identifier there, but there it is there. You'll notice I don't have the layer style of the animation of the little particles and stuff there, but if I double click on that thumbnail, it will open again, and there it is there. And if I do the drop down, there's the animation there, and I can do whatever I want. And as soon as I Control S or Command S on a Mac, it will save through and update in this document. So it's going to resave through to that smart object of embers. But because this is now a contained element, this is a contained smart object, I can now go to my layer styles, FX, and let's go color overlay. And and now I've got the blend mode. I've got it set to normal because I just want it, I just want it orange. I don't want any blend modes, which you can do, but most blend modes aren't going to work on pure black or pure white anyway. So there it is there, and I'm going to hit OK. Awesome. But not looking great. It's just orange at the moment. It could be orange snow. So let's jump in again and let's do something like an outer glow. And by the way, you can access all of these directly. You don't have to turn on and off every time as well. So outer glow, let's play around with some different colors here. I think the orange is probably still going to work for this, and I might change the color and then play around with some of the blend modes. So I'm going with overlay. That's usually quite a winner for that. And I'm going to switch to my color. It's a bit orangey, so let's maybe drop that down to sort of a more of a reddy color. See how that looks. And just sort of kick these things around. Cool. Let's jump out of that. Let's go back to our outer glow, And we can play around with the opacity and the spread and the size and all that kind of stuff just to get those little glows. And obviously if you've got a darker background, it's really going to play around. Other ones to play around with is the contour. So the contour, you're going to get some really interesting effects. So depending on which one you click on, you get some really weird sort of effects popping from these different contours, as you can see. So just for plain ones, I usually either go for these two on the left here, which is our straight curve, and we can push that out and all the rest of it. Done and done. Let's just push those out a little bit. I tend to overdo things a little bit for demos just because when you really get into the subtleties, it's kind of a bit more nuancy sort of thing. Anyway, let's just leave that for now. Try a few different blend modes as well. So I'm going to stick with overlay for this one. So a lot of things to sort of play around with there, and of course once you save that out, you can see we can start getting those little glowing particles. I'm actually just going to add a new layer above this, and I just want to darken up my my cloud layer. There's heaps of ways to do this. I'm actually going to use I'm just going to do a color fill just to start with, and just change that to something like multiply or color burn or something like that. And then if I wanted to, I could always jump in and adjust the colorization of that, or I can jump in and go, let's do a gradient overlay on this one, and I've got color burn, and as you can see, you can really sort of mess around with the colorization and all that kind of fun stuff. You can get some really weird and wacky things by playing around with this kind of stuff. But that's kind of getting there, and you can see there's our little embers, and they are glowing, and they are moving as well. So we've got the cloud movement in the background, and I've got this little colored layer over the top, and there they are. So cool. It's kind of getting there. There's a few other things that we can play around with that I'll show you in the next steps, just to add a little bit more effect. But as you can see, it's just a really nice little quick way of getting some embers going. Once it's run it through a few times, you can kind of get that going. And if you wanted to, you could do multiples of this and adjust the sizings. So I'm actually going to do that right now. I'm going to show you how to adjust some of these little elements here. So jump into my embers here. Don't forget, we've already got we've already animated inside the embers here as a smart object of them just moving. We're just moving the layer style here, and what I'm going to do now instead is I'm going to inside, let's close that down, sorry, let's just find the proper document, is I actually just want to animate the probably the outer glow for these. You get these little outer glows popping, as you can see. So let's just see if I can actually find one that's going to work in the dark as well. I do recommend just sort of running through some of the blend modes. How's hard light going to work? Hard light's going to be pretty good, I think. It's going to pick up on the darker areas there. There we go. Just a nice little outer glow popping there. Cool. Okay, so what I'm going to do is now layer style. Let's start animating the layer style. So hit the stopwatch there, and maybe what we'll do is we'll go to about the halfway point, roughly about there. Let's go to outer glow, and what I might do is maybe just ramp up the size a little, see how that looks. Cool. And what we should be able to see is that it's very subtle, but that glow is going to ramp up a bit as it hits the apex of the storm, or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to drop in a blank keyframe there, and I'm going to go to this first one, copy. So it's going to copy that layer style there. Let's go to the end one without shifting it, right click and paste, and you can see it pastes the original one there. So we're going to end up with just more of a glow in the center where we adjusted it, and out the way. So this is quite subtle, but it's just going to add a little bit of effect of this. And we could do that even with things like the color overlay as well. So I could I could potentially go, I'm going to change the colors to blue for whatever reason, and hit OK, And what you should be able to find is that these are going to change color now. They end up blue and then back to whatever they were when we placed the keyframes in. I'm not a big fan of that, so I'm going to go back to the keyframe there and just switch that back to maybe just a sort of more of a ready color, maybe more yellow. Yeah, stick with the orange, and so on and so forth. So, animating the layer styles is really kind of fun for this. I'm going to pause the video here. I do want to show you a couple more quick tricks as far as just getting a little bit more motion in this. So I'm going to pause this for a sec and we'll be back with you shortly.